In the final winter of the Second World War, Japan stood at the edge of collapse. Its empire, once spread from Manchuria to the Solomons, had been strangled by blockade and bombardment. Allied submarines prowled every shipping lane from Formosa to the Strait of Malacca, and what had been the world's third-largest merchant fleet was now a graveyard scattered across the Pacific. Tokyo's factories lay silent for want of oil. Its cities burned nightly under the glow of American incendiaries, and even the once mighty Imperial Navy was reduced to rusting hulks moored in harbors without fuel to sail. Yet, in that desolation, a plan was conceived, a final gamble to prolong the empire's heartbeat. It would be called Operation Kita, the Return Voyage. 2 heavy cruisers, Ashigara and Oyodo, an auxiliary carrier, Kamoi, and 2 giant tankers, Tamamaru and Eniwa-maru, were ordered to attempt the impossible, sail from Singapore back to Japan through waters ruled entirely by American submarines, carrying 40,000 tons of aviation fuel, rubber, tin, and tungsten, the last breath of a dying empire. The officers who drafted the orders understood the odds. Every convoy that had left Singapore since the previous autumn had been annihilated. But to refuse was to accept death, and in those last months the line between courage and denial had vanished. Singapore, once the Gibraltar of the East, was now a fortress of desperation. The docks were pocked by bomb craters, cranes bent like skeletons over half-sunken freighters. Inside the Japanese naval headquarters at Seletar, Admiral Shigeru Fukudome reviewed charts marked with red X's, each an American submarine patrol zone. He had commanded fleets during the Empire's expansion years and knew that by 1945, Japan was fighting a war measured not in victories but in days bought. The order from Tokyo was simple. The homeland must receive oil, no matter the cost. Fukudome chose his fastest remaining ships and his most disciplined crews. The vessels were refitted under strict secrecy. Welders patched hull plates riddled with shrapnel, signalmen painted new camouflage patterns to break silhouettes against the gray tropic haze, and engineers triple-checked the boilers that had not run at full capacity in months. By February 10th, the fleet was ready. That morning, the air over Keppel Harbor hung heavy with humidity and the smell of fuel. Civilians gathered silently along the piers as the ships prepared to depart. There were no speeches or music, only the groan of mooring lines and the slow churn of propellers as the first vessel eased into the channel. On the bridge of Oyodo, Captain Takeda watched the shoreline recede into mist. He had served since before the war and had seen triumph turn to attrition, belief to exhaustion. As Singapore disappeared astern, he wrote in his log, "We sail homeward through seas haunted by ghosts." Below decks, engineers sweated in the stifling heat, coaxing reluctant engines to life. In the bunkrooms, sailors packed photographs of families they might never see again. The convoy slipped northward along the coast of Malaya, engines throttled low to reduce smoke. Radio silence was absolute. Orders forbade even encrypted transmissions. The only voices were shouted across decks and the low rumble of machinery echoing through steel corridors. Far away on Guam, in a cool underground room lined with radios, Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of the United States Submarine Force, Pacific Fleet, COM-Sub-PAC, studied a decrypted Japanese weather report. The message was routine but its origin unusual. Singapore, Allied codebreakers at Pearl Harbor, had already warned him that the Japanese were planning something large. For weeks, intelligence intercepts had mentioned special cargo and homeward movement. To Lockwood's staff, that could only mean fuel. He ordered a network of submarines, Burgall, Blower, and Blackfin, to establish a picket line across the South China Sea. Their mission: intercept and destroy whatever tried to escape from Singapore. None of them yet knew they were hunting what would become known as the Ghost Convoy. As dusk fell over the Malacca Strait, the Japanese formation entered one of the most dangerous corridors in the Pacific. Allied aircraft from Sumatra patrolled these skies daily, and American submarines had turned the strait into a killing ground. Rain squalls rolled in from the west, shrouding the ships in curtains of water so thick that even lookouts could barely see their own bows. The storm, a curse to the crews drenched on deck, was a blessing to their survival. Radar screens on distant American subs filled with static, sonar echoes blurred with the roar of the rain. Commander Ben Jarvis of Burgall later wrote that the monsoon itself seemed to hide them. For 3 days, the convoy crept north, hugging coastlines and using islands as cover. The destroyers in escort formation switched positions hourly to confuse potential trackers. Their sonar operators strained over headphones, distinguishing between the growl of propellers and the rumble of distant thunder. Every few hours, the escorts dropped practice depth charges, small explosions meant to deter unseen pursuers. Below decks, Japanese sailors counted the seconds between detonations, their nerves tightening each time the hull shivered. Food was scarce and wet. Rice turned sour in the humidity. Men slept beside their stations because space was too cramped to lie down elsewhere. They measured time not by clocks, but by the sound of the engines changing pitch. Meanwhile, at Pearl Harbor, ultra-crypt analysts picked apart a series of brief Japanese radio bursts that mentioned atmospheric pressure and sea temperature. To most, they looked like harmless weather updates. To trained eyes, they were position markers used for navigation. Plotting them on a map, analysts realized the transmissions formed a north-northeast line from Singapore. The convoy was headed toward Japan through the center of the South China Sea. The information reached Lockwood within hours. He ordered every available submarine to converge. "This may be their last oil," he told his staff. "If we sink it, we finish the empire." Back at sea, the Japanese ships crossed the equator under a sky streaked with lightning. The air smelled of ozone and fuel. Captain Takeda stood on the bridge of Oyodo and watched the horizon flicker. He knew that American submarines would be waiting near the Nicobar Islands, the narrowest passage before open sea. His only defense was unpredictability. Each night he altered course, sometimes east, sometimes west, following currents rather than charts. The convoy moved like a shadow, its formation loose enough to avoid mass detection, yet tight enough to support each other if attacked. At dawn on February 12th, they passed the islands unseen. For once, fortune favored them. In the Burgall's control room, Jarvis's sonar operator caught a faint rhythmic thrum, multiple propellers, slow and synchronized. "Convoy, bearing 095, he whispered. The captain raised the periscope, scanning the horizon, but heavy swells obscured visibility. Nothing but gray. He waited, listening. The sound grew fainter, then vanished. Somewhere out there, the enemy was slipping past. Jarvis ordered pursuit at flank speed, but when they reached the suspected position, the sea was empty. Later, he would learn that the convoy had changed course only minutes earlier, diving into a rain front that masked it completely. For the next 48 hours, the Americans hunted in vain. By February 14th, the Japanese ships were deep in the South China Sea. The weather cleared, exposing them to aerial detection. Lookouts scanned the skies constantly for the glint of American B-24 Liberators. The heat was suffocating, decks shimmered, and fuel drums expanded under pressure. Sailors moved barefoot to avoid burns from the metal. At night, they kept all lights extinguished, smoking only inside sealed compartments. Superstitions flourished. Some carried paper charms from Shinto priests. Others whispered that spirits of sunken comrades guided them. The officers said little. Their orders were to reach home or die trying. Far to the east, Allied intelligence tracked the convoy's progress through occasional signal leaks. Routine position reports sent in codes the Japanese believed unbreakable. By correlating them with weather data, analysts estimated the convoy's location within 50 miles. Lockwood deployed another wolf pack north of Borneo. It was a vast chessboard of steel, patience, and luck, played out in a sea of storms. Every submarine commander knew the stakes. If they failed, Japan might extend the war by months. If they succeeded, the Empire's last reserves would vanish beneath the waves. As the convoy approached the Luzon Strait, the ocean grew treacherous with cross-currents and typhoons. Waves slammed the hulls, washing over decks and twisting radar masts. Inside the ships, pumps struggled to keep bilges dry. Yet, morale held. For the sailors, hardship was nothing new. What mattered was the silence of the horizon. Each dawn, that brought no periscope or airplane, felt like a reprieve from fate. Captain Takeda compared it to walking through a graveyard at night, hearing the wind move, but not the dead. His navigator nodded as she said nothing. By February 15th, the Japanese were within striking distance of Formosa. Fuel consumption had been higher than expected, and the escort destroyers were running low. They refueled at sea, a dangerous maneuver in high swell. Barrels rolled across decks, men shouting as hoses snapped loose, spraying raw gasoline into the air. One spark could have destroyed the fleet. Yet somehow, they completed the transfer without disaster. That night, the ship steamed on under a moon half hidden by cloud. The sea was calm again, unnervingly calm, as if the world were holding its breath. And somewhere in that same darkness, American submarines drifted in ambush, their crews listening through headphones to the faint pulse of propellers that would soon vanish again into the vast, indifferent ocean. The Ghost Convoy entered the most perilous stretch of its journey in mid-February of 1945, when it crossed from the South China Sea into the Luzon Strait. This narrow corridor between the Philippines and Taiwan had become one of the most heavily patrolled submarine zones in the Pacific. Every mile of ocean there seemed to echo with propeller noise, the ghosts of ships already claimed by war. For the Americans, this was their hunting ground. For the Japanese, it was a graveyard they had no choice but to cross. On the morning of February 14th, the sky cleared after days of storms, revealing a calm expanse of blue water that should have comforted the crews. Instead, it terrified them. Clear weather meant visibility, and visibility meant death. Lookouts were doubled, binoculars pressed to sweating faces as every glint on the horizon was mistaken for a periscope. Inside the bridges, officers whispered rather than spoke, afraid that even sound might draw attention. The Ashigara led the formation now, her bow cutting a thin scar through the sea. The Oyodo followed close behind, flanked by the tankers and the auxiliary carrier Kamoy. Their speed was limited to 12 knots to conserve fuel, a crawl in open ocean, but enough to stay ahead of the slower freighters that dotted Japan's remaining supply lines. At Pearl Harbor, ultra codebreakers continued to intercept fragments of weather and navigational updates. Each message, decrypted and translated, was a clue in a puzzle stretching across thousands of miles. One analyst, a young woman named Sarah Mitchell, noticed that several of the transmissions used identical phrasing to those recorded in Singapore a week earlier. It meant the same operator was still active. She plotted the coordinates and realized that the convoy was roughly halfway to Formosa. Her report reached Lockwood within hours, and he ordered the USS Bergall and USS Blower to reposition along the projected path. "It's a race against time now," he told his staff. "They've been lucky so far. Let's make sure luck runs out." But at sea, luck is a tide that no one commands. On February 15th, Commander Jarvis aboard the Bergall detected what he believed to be a large convoy moving northeast at slow speed. He ordered a dive to periscope depth and prepared an attack run. The sonar pings came steady and strong, too strong. As the periscope broke the surface, the captain saw not ships, but the reflection of lightning on a distant squall. The ocean had fooled him. For an hour, they pursued the phantom contacted before realizing the truth. When the storm cleared, the sea was empty. The convoy had slipped through another gap in the net, moving silently beneath a low ceiling of clouds that jammed Allied radar. Jarvis cursed softly and wrote in his log, "The ghosts are faster than we are." Meanwhile, aboard the Ashigara, life blurred into a rhythm of routine and dread. Every 4 hours, the general quarters alarm sounded for drills, the men rushing to their battle stations in near darkness. The air below deck was thick with diesel fumes and sweat. Condensation dripped from bulkheads, forming puddles that never dried. The engineers worked shirtless, their bodies glistening with oil, while above them gunners stood at the ready, scanning an empty horizon. Food was running low. The cook stretched rice with barley and seawater. At night, some men dreamed of their homes, others of the ocean swallowing them whole. One petty officer wrote later that each wave seemed like the breath of something watching us. It was not fear alone they felt, but the weight of inevitability, the sense that they were part of a story already decided by forces beyond their control. On February 16th, an Allied reconnaissance plane flying from Palawan caught sight of faint ship wakes near the Bashi Channel. The pilot radioed coordinates before being chased off by anti-aircraft fire. His report reached Guam, where Lockwood convened his staff in the early morning hours. The room was dimly lit, cigarette smoke hanging over the table as officers debated the convoy's exact position. Some argued it was a decoy, others that the Japanese had changed course again. Lockwood listened, then simply said, "Every hour we wait, they get closer to home." He ordered additional submarines, Blackfin, Pargo, and Cod, to close in from the east. The plan was to form a moving barrier ahead of the convoy's suspected route. But the ocean had its own plans. A tropical depression sweeping up from the south shifted the currents and forced the Japanese ships farther west than expected. By the time the submarines arrived, the convoy was already beyond them. As the sun rose on February 17th, the horizon ahead of Ashigara turned pale gold. The crew realized they were within 2 days of the Japanese home islands. Cheers were forbidden, but smiles spread across exhausted faces. They had survived the gauntlet of the South China Sea, evaded submarines and aircraft, and carried their precious cargo within reach of home. Captain Takeda stood on the bridge beside his navigator, both men staring at the faint outline of clouds that marked the direction of Kyushu. "It seems," Takeda said quietly, "that the gods have turned their eyes away." His navigator replied, "Perhaps they are tired too." For the Americans, the failure to intercept the convoy was a bitter pill. Commander Jarvis submitted a terse patrol report describing multiple false contacts and heavy weather interference. He admitted that his torpedoes had not left the tubes even once during the entire mission. In Washington, naval analysts reviewed the data and concluded that the convoy's survival was the result of exceptional discipline and luck. The Japanese had maintained strict radio silence, changed course unpredictably, and exploited weather patterns with uncanny precision. It was a tactical success for an enemy on the verge of annihilation. Lockwood's summary of the episode contained only one line: "They sailed with death all around them and reached home untouched. That deserves respect." When the convoy finally arrived in Japan on February 21st, it was greeted not by fanfare, but by secrecy. The ships docked under cover of darkness at Moji and Kuri, their cargo unloaded by naval police who treated the operation as classified. Barrels of fuel were rushed to airfields and refineries, while crates of rubber and tin disappeared into warehouses. Officially, the voyage did not exist. Newspapers made no mention of it, and most civilians never learned that Japan's last major supply convoy had returned from Singapore. For the sailors who had survived, there were no parades, no medals, only exhaustion and a quiet sense of completion. They had done their duty, and that was enough. But even as the ships rested in harbor, the oil they had carried began its transformation from salvation to destruction. Within weeks, Allied B-29 bombers were dropping incendiary weapons fueled by the same petroleum the convoy had delivered. The irony was bitter and inescapable. The cargo that had been meant to defend Japan now burned its cities instead. By March, Kure and Tokyo were engulfed in firestorms that consumed entire districts. Some of the sailors who had brought the oil watched from the hills as the sky turned red, understanding that their triumph had only delayed the inevitable. One survivor later wrote, "We brought home the blood of the empire, and it was used to burn the body." In the months that followed, the ships of Operation Kita met their fates one by one. The Ashigara, after surviving the voyage, was reassigned to transport troops from Java in June and was torpedoed and sunk by a British submarine near the Banka Strait. More than 1,000 men went down with her. The Kamoa was sunk by American aircraft near Kobe in March, her decks erupting in flames that could be seen for miles. The Oyodo remained anchored in Kure until July, when carrier aircraft from Task Force 38 struck the harbor and set her ablaze. She capsized in shallow water, her bridge still visible when Japan surrendered a month later. Of the two tankers, neither survived the summer. By the end of the war, every ship of the Ghost Convoy lay broken on the seafloor. For historians, Operation Kite would later symbolize both the brilliance and futility of late-war Japan. It proved that discipline and seamanship could still achieve miracles even in hopeless circumstances, yet it also underscored how little those miracles mattered when an empire had already bled itself dry. The voyage delivered fuel that could not save the war, resources that could not rebuild the fleet, and courage that could not alter fate. And yet, for the men who sailed, that single success remained their final act of service, a moment when the machinery of an empire still worked as it was designed to, before the silence of surrender descended forever. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Operation Kita was already dissolving into rumor. The official records of the Imperial Navy made only passing mention of a convoy that had departed Singapore in February, its details hidden behind euphemisms like Southern Transport Mission. Allied occupation officers who scoured naval archives in Tokyo found almost nothing: a handful of coded dispatches, a few requisition orders for oil drums, and a burned corner of a logbook recovered from Kuri. It was as though the voyage had been erased by design. The survivors returned quietly to civilian life. Some became fishermen, others mechanics or railway workers. They told their families little, partly from trauma, partly from a sense that their story belonged to a world that no longer existed. Japan had been reduced to rubble, and the new nation that emerged under occupation had no appetite for tales of the old Navy's final stand. The men of the Ghost Convoy carried their memories like sealed containers, valuable, volatile, and impossible to open without spilling pain. In the immediate post-war years, Allied intelligence analysts reconstructed the operation from fragments. At Pearl Harbor, a team of linguists cross-referenced ultra decrypts with captured Japanese merchant shipping tables. Piece by piece, the picture emerged. 5 ships, 2 heavy cruisers, 1 escort carrier, 2 oil tankers, and a handful of destroyers departing Singapore on February 10, 1945, arriving safely at Moji 11 days later. The analysts were astonished. No other Japanese convoy of that size had survived the South China Sea after 1944. In the classified summaries that circulated through the U.S. Navy, Operation Kita was labeled an exceptional example of evasion under extreme risk. The phrase became a quiet compliment within the submarine community, a grudging salute to an adversary who had slipped past the most lethal blockade in history. For Admiral Lockwood, the man who had commanded the American submarines that failed to intercept it, the convoy lingered like a personal ghost. In his memoirs, he wrote, "They were the last disciplined fleet Japan ever sent to sea, and they beat us, not in battle, but in nerve." He acknowledged that luck played its part, but he admired the precision of the Japanese seamanship that had exploited every gap in Allied coverage. To Lockwood, Operation Kita represented the paradox of total war, victory built on overwhelming force confronted by an enemy's last flicker of skill and resolve. In Japan, the story remained largely unknown until the 1960s, when maritime historians began sifting through declassified American archives. Among them was Akira Yoshimura, a former naval cadet turned writer, who discovered the ultra decrypts referencing a convoy carrying vital materials north from Singapore. Intrigued, he tracked down surviving crewmen from Oyodo and Kamoy. Their recollections were fragmentary, snippets of storm, fear, and silence, but together they formed the skeleton of a forgotten narrative. Yoshimura published a short article titled "The Voyage Home," arguing that Operation Kita was the Imperial Navy's last coherent mission, a line drawn under an era of faith in steel and discipline. The piece attracted modest attention but inspired further research. Naval Veterans Associations invited Yoshimura to speak, and younger historians began seeking out remaining eyewitnesses before they vanished. Those interviews painted a vivid portrait of exhaustion and professionalism. One former helmsman recalled steering by dead reckoning when clouds obscured the stars, terrified of drifting too close to the Borneo coast where Allied submarines waited. Another remembered the eerie calm when they crossed the equator, every man on deck aware that no Japanese warship might ever pass that point again. An engineer from Ashigara described how the engine room temperature reached 130 degrees Fahrenheit, the air so thick with fumes that sailors collapsed from dizziness. "We could not breathe," he said, "but we kept turning the valves because stopping meant shame." Their testimonies transformed the convoy from a logistical footnote into a human story, a portrait of endurance stripped of ideology. By the 1970s, Operation Kita began to appear in Japanese naval histories as a symbol of determination rather than defiance. In documentaries produced by NHK, aging veterans spoke with understated pride, emphasizing not patriotism but duty. "We were not fighting for victory," said one officer. "We were fighting to finish our orders." This distinction mattered deeply in a country grappling with the moral legacy of its wartime actions. The convoy's story offered a rare narrative untainted by aggression, a mission about survival, not conquest. Across the Pacific, American historians took renewed interest as well. The Naval War College analyzed the voyage as a case study in intelligence failure. Lectures compared it to Allied supply operations through the North Atlantic, highlighting the same lessons: discipline, weather, and deception. Young officers studying anti-submarine warfare were taught to respect the unpredictability of the sea. Even with perfect information, one instructor warned, you can still lose sight of what you're hunting. The Ghost Convoy became a metaphor for the limits of technological certainty, a reminder that nature and human will can conspire to defeat even the most comprehensive surveillance. Meanwhile, the physical traces of the operation slowly re-emerged from the deep. In the 1990s, maritime archaeologists mapping Japanese waters discovered large sections of wreckage near Kyushu and the Inland Sea. Among them were fragments of Oyodo's bridge and gun turrets from Ashigara recovered by fishermen. Museums in Kure and Yokosuka began exhibiting these artifacts with simple labels. Recovered from Operation Kita vessels, 1945. Visitors rarely lingered, unaware of the quiet drama behind the rusted steel. But for veterans who came to see them, the displays were sacred. One survivor placed a small paper crane beside a corroded compass and whispered, "We made it home. That was enough." As time passed, the Ghost Convoy evolved from historical curiosity to cultural touchstone. Writers and filmmakers found in it a perfect allegory for the end of the Pacific War, an empire running on empty, sustained by habit and hope. In the early 2000s, a documentary titled The Convoy That Should Have Died aired on Japanese television, intercutting survivor interviews with newly digitized American reconnaissance footage. The program's closing narration captured the enduring fascination. They sailed through a sea already owned by death, and somehow they arrived. History forgot them, but the ocean did not. The broadcast revived national interest. Schools near former naval bases began inviting historians to speak about the voyage, emphasizing its lessons on perseverance and humility. In the West, interest spiked again after a 2015 joint Japanese-American research expedition located the wreck of Ashigara at a depth of 400 meters off Kyushu's southern coast. The sonar images showed the cruiser resting on her side, her hull split but her superstructure intact. When remotely operated vehicles descended, cameras revealed the ship's nameplate still legible beneath a forest of coral. The discovery made international headlines. For the first time since 1945, the physical reality of Operation Kita could be seen, not just imagined. The expedition recovered several small items: a clock stopped at 10:40 a.m., a brass plate reading Noba 3 boiler room, and a navigation instrument engraved with the date of the voyage. Each artifact told a fragment of the same story: men performing their duty to the last minute of a vanishing world. At the memorial ceremony that followed, held in Kagoshima, descendants of the crew gathered alongside historians and naval officers from both nations. Wreaths were lowered into the sea as a naval band played softly. An elderly American submariner, once a lieutenant aboard Blackfin, attended as a guest. Reporters asked if he felt vindicated now that the wreck had been found. He shook his head. "No," he said. "They were sailors, same as us. They did their job, we did ours. The sea kept the score." His words captured the tone of reconciliation that had grown between former enemies who shared the same profession and the same scars. For scholars, Operation Kita's rediscovery provided more than closure. It offered insight into the psychology of collapse. It demonstrated how organizations, even when facing certain defeat, cling to procedure and purpose. The convoy was not a miracle. It was the logical outcome of training, planning, and belief in structure amid chaos. That lesson resonates far beyond naval history. It speaks to how humans confront the end of systems they have built, by continuing to act as if order still exists. In this sense, the Ghost Convoy is less about ships and more about the persistence of meaning when meaning itself is slipping away. Today, in maritime museums across Japan, small exhibits honor the voyage. Visitors read placards describing how 2 cruisers and 3 support ships carried oil through seas ruled by the enemy and arrived safely in February 1945. Few realize the enormity of what that meant, that amid firebombs, starvation, and ruin, a handful of men accomplished something their entire empire could no longer do. The story endures not through triumph, but through tone, quiet, precise, and human. To stand before those relics is to feel the echo of engines turning in darkness, the vibration of steel cutting through rain, and the unspoken prayer that drives all who go to sea, that they might reach home, no matter the cost. The voyage of the Ghost Convoy was not a single dash through danger, but a grinding test of endurance that stretched across nearly 2 weeks of uncertainty. Every hour at sea was a negotiation between discipline and fear. For the Japanese sailors aboard Ashigara, Oyodo, and the supporting ships, time seemed to lose meaning. The clocks still ticked, but their rhythm no longer matched the human bodies. Men slept in short bursts when allowed, their dreams filled with the vibration of engines and the constant hum of machinery. Below decks, the air was hot and foul, a stew of diesel fumes, sweat, and rust. The steel bulkheads dripped with condensation, creating an illusion of rain inside the ship. Food came twice a day, thin rice, dried fish, and occasionally pickled vegetables. The cooks fought a losing battle against humidity. The rice clumped into gray paste before it reached the mess decks. Yet the crews never complained aloud. The unspoken rule of the sea remained. If the ship was still moving, there was hope. At night, the ocean turned from mirror to abyss. The moon, when it appeared, cast pale light that glittered off the oil drums lashed to the tanker's decks. Lookouts perched on the bridge wings peered into that darkness, searching for anything: an enemy periscope, the faint shadow of a torpedo wake, the silhouette of an approaching aircraft. Their eyes burned from strain, their minds playing tricks. More than once, a sailor shouted a false alarm, mistaking floating debris for an American submarine. Each time, the captain responded calmly, never rebuking them. Better 1,000 false sightings than one moment of complacency. Beneath them, sonar operators listened through headphones, the world reduced to pings and echoes. They tapped readings on notepads, marking faint contacts that came and went like ghosts in static. The sea was full of noise, fish, currents, even the ship's own machinery. But in that cacophony, one clear metallic rhythm could mean death. On the Allied side, the pursuit was just as tense. In the cramped control room of the USS Blower, Commander Leon Cheshire studied a hydrophone trace on a narrow paper strip. The pattern was unmistakable, multiple screws, evenly spaced, maintaining formation speed. Somewhere ahead lay the convoy. He ordered silent running and began to stalk the sound. The submarine crept through the depths at 3 knots, men whispering as they worked. Even a dropped wrench could betray their presence. Cheshire's executive officer watched the depth gauge tremble as they descended to 200 feet. The pressure creaked along the hull. "If we're right," Cheshire murmured, "they're heading for the Bashi Channel." Hours passed. The contact grew stronger, then vanished. The ocean had swallowed it again. The men slumped back, exhausted, uncertain if they had lost the enemy or been avoided by skill. Meanwhile, on Ashigara, Captain Inuse kept a log so meticulous it later astonished historians who recovered fragments of it. He recorded not only coordinates and engine revolutions, but also the emotional temperature of his crew. Morale steady, men fatigued, spirits reflective. Each entry ended with the same line: course unchanged, homeward. The log stopped abruptly after the 16th of February, when the convoy passed through the Bashi Channel and entered the East China Sea. Whether the final pages were lost, destroyed, or never written remains unknown. Some historians believe Inoue stopped writing because the voyage had entered a phase where words could no longer capture experience, when every moment felt like borrowed time. For the codebreakers at Pearl Harbor, the operation was a masterclass in frustration. They decrypted at least 4 weather signals during the voyage, each indicating the convoy's progress north. But by the time the information reached Lockwood's submarines, the Japanese had already changed course or vanished behind another storm. One analyst compared it to chasing shadows painted on water. Ultra's power had reshaped the Pacific War, turning intelligence into a weapon more precise than guns, yet even it could be blinded by nature. The ocean remained an unpredictable ally. Clouds, rain, and current betrayed the precision of men. In a later report, Lockwood wrote that the Japanese sailed not by charts, but by chaos, and chaos protected them. As the convoy pushed closer to the home islands, danger multiplied rather than diminished. American B-24 patrols now ranged from Okinawa, and radar coverage along the Ryukyu Arc had expanded. The Japanese captains held daily briefings on the flag bridge of Oyodo, charting potential air patrol zones and ordering deceptive maneuvers. They timed their crossings of open water for dusk or dawn, when light was weakest. When radar warnings crackled through the speakers, every ship went dark, running without lights for hours at a time. The ocean around them turned black, and even the horizon disappeared. Sailors described the sensation of floating through space rather than sea. It was a sensory void that both terrified and numbed them. During one such blackout, a destroyer in the escort group picked up sonar contact directly beneath its bow. The operator shouted, "Possible submarine!" and the bridge erupted in orders. Depth charges rolled off the stern, exploding in dull thumps that rattled dishes in Ashigara's galley. For 15 minutes, the convoy steamed at full speed, guns manned, until the noise faded. No oil slick appeared, no wreckage surfaced. Whether it had been an American submarine or a false echo will never be known. The captain of Oyodo later recalled that the sea was alive with ghosts, some real, some imagined. On February 17th, near the Nansei Islands, the convoy faced one final hazard. Allied mines, laid by submarines months earlier, drifted unpredictably with the currents. Japanese minesweepers had cleared a path weeks before, but storms had likely moved the deadly spheres. The escort destroyers formed a lane abreast, sweeping the route with paravanes, steel cables designed to cut mine moorings. Sailors watched in tense silence as the devices skimmed the waves. Twice they heard the sharp clang of contact followed by muffled explosions. A cheer went up each time, quickly silenced by the officers. The convoy pressed on, engines groaning, propellers thrumming in a rhythm that seemed to echo the human heart. Inside the American command centers, tension gave way to resignation. Reports indicated that the Japanese ships had passed the last patrol barrier. Lockwood's staff gathered for a final debrief, the maps littered with pencil marks and missed opportunities. No one spoke for several minutes. Finally, Lockwood sighed and said, "Gentlemen, the ocean gave them mercy." He closed the file and moved on to the next operation. Yet even he could not forget the lesson. The failure to intercept Operation Kita became a permanent entry in the training manuals of the Pacific Fleet. It taught a generation of submariners that mastery of technology did not guarantee mastery of war. When the convoy entered the narrow waters of Kyushu, the smell of land reached the sailors before the coastline appeared, a faint trace of soil and pine carried on the wind. Men crowded the decks, straining for the first sight of Japan. Some wept openly, others stood rigid, afraid that acknowledging relief might summon disaster. Captain Takeda allowed himself a single deep breath and ordered signal flags raised. Mission complete, homebound cargo delivered. In Tokyo, the message was received by Naval Headquarters and forwarded to the Imperial General Staff. No reply was sent. By then, the war had reached a point where success was indistinguishable from postponement. That night, as the convoy anchored at Moji, the harbor lay in blackout. Only the faint glow of oil refineries lit the horizon. Crews began unloading immediately. Barrels rolled down ramps, their metal rims screeching against steel. The air stank of gasoline. Shore workers in ragged uniforms worked through the night, moving cargo that would fuel planes and vehicles for only a few more weeks. When dawn came, the ships were empty, their decks slick with oil and salt. The men stood in formation for inspection, expecting commendations that never came. Their commanding officers simply saluted and dismissed them. The voyage was over, and with it, the last heartbeat of Japan's naval supply system. In the months that followed, the memory of Operation Kita spread quietly through the fleet. Among surviving sailors, it became a story told in mess halls and barracks, part pride, part elegy. They called it the run through hell. In April, when American bombers destroyed Kure and most of the remaining warships, those who had served on the convoy felt a strange calm. "We had already said goodbye to the sea," one man wrote. "Everything afterward was only waiting." Years later, historians would look back and marvel at the precision that carried those ships home. The Japanese captains had used every advantage left to them: weather, timing, silence, and courage. Their success did not change the outcome of the war, but it revealed the enduring power of discipline under impossible pressure. That is why the Ghost Convoy endures in naval lore, not as a symbol of victory or defeat, but as proof that even at the end of the world, men could still act with purpose. In the decades that followed the war, Operation Kita drifted through the archives of both nations like a half-remembered dream. In Japan, official naval histories written during the 1950s and 60s focused on the grand battles, the victories of the early years, the tragedies of Midway, Leyte, and Okinawa. The small, desperate convoy from Singapore received only a passing mention, usually a single line in appendices listing final transport operations. Yet, among scholars of logistics and communications, whispers persisted that something extraordinary had occurred in February 1945. The voyage defied probability. 5 large ships crossing waters patrolled by hundreds of Allied submarines and aircraft, and not a single torpedo striking home. For years, the story lived only in rumors, veterans' conversations, and the private curiosity of historians who sensed a gap in the record. By the late 1960s, a new generation of Japanese researchers began peeling back the layers of censorship that had obscured the operation. Among them was naval historian Akira Yoshimura, who spent years searching through U.S. military microfilms and declassified ultra decrypts. He discovered that Allied analysts had tracked a southern convoy through intercepted weather messages, identifying it only after the war as Operation Kita. Yoshimura wrote a short essay titled Voyage Through the Blockade, in which he called the mission a perfect paradox, a success that meant nothing, achieved by men who knew it meant nothing and yet carried it out flawlessly. The essay circulated quietly among academics, but struck a nerve with naval veterans who saw their forgotten service reflected in it. Letters began arriving at Yoshimura's home from former sailors eager to tell their stories before time erased them. From those letters emerged fragments of lived experience: the suffocating heat of the boiler rooms, the unending vibration of the engines, the silence that hung over the decks like fog. One survivor from the convoy wrote, "We did not fear the enemy, we feared being forgotten." Another recalled that during the crossing, he had dreamed of seeing his wife on the pier at Moji, only to wake and find nothing but darkness and the hum of turbines. These memories gave flesh to what had once been a dry logistical note in wartime archives. Yoshimura compiled them into a book, published in 1974. It sold modestly, but inspired a wave of documentaries and interviews that finally gave Operation Kita a place in Japan's collective memory. At the same time, American naval historians revisited their own records, realizing how close they had come to intercepting the convoy. Analysts compared sonar traces from the USS Burgall and Blower and discovered that on February 14, 1945, the submarines had indeed passed within 60 miles of the Japanese formation, an invisible near collision between hunter and hunted. Declassified ultrafiles revealed that Allied commanders had known the convoy existed, but had misjudged its route by less than a day. The realization produced not embarrassment, but fascination. Operation Kita became a teaching case at the Naval War College and the Submarine School in Groton, Connecticut, a lesson in humility and the unpredictable variables of war. In one lecture from 1981, a commander summarized the episode by saying, "Even when you control the sky, the sea belongs to no one." Meanwhile, the physical remnants of the convoy slept undisturbed in the deep. The Ashigara, sunk in June 1945 while evacuating troops from Java, lay beneath hundreds of meters of water in the Banka Strait. The Oyodo rested near Kure Harbor, scuttled and half buried in silt. For decades, fishermen near Kyushu hauled up twisted shards of metal they called devil's bones, unaware they came from the empire's last surviving convoy. In 1994, Japanese maritime archaeologists began an extensive survey of wartime wrecks, combining historical research with sonar imaging. Their aim was to map the underwater graveyard left by the war. When they reached the southern coast of Japan, they found an enormous hull lying on its side, her guns still visible through coral growth. The sonar technician whispered, "Ashigara." The confirmation came years later. In 2015, a joint Japanese-American expedition revisited the site using remotely operated vehicles equipped with 4K cameras and manipulator arms. The expedition leader, Professor Kenji Mori of Tokyo University, had spent most of his career studying wartime shipbuilding. For him, the discovery was not about treasure or glory, but about closure. "When we find these ships," he said, "we recover the stories of the men who never came home." The footage that followed stunned viewers worldwide. The camera panned across the deck of Ashigara, showing encrusted guns, collapsed bulkheads, and the faint outline of Japanese characters etched into the hull, the ship's name still legible after 70 years underwater. Inside, ROVs found instruments frozen in place, engine telegraphs set to full ahead, dials still marked with factory numbers, and a rusted teacup resting on a control panel. It was as though time had stopped mid-voyage. The discovery reignited public interest. Television networks aired documentaries comparing wartime photos with the new underwater imagery. Veterans who had served on the convoy appeared on camera, their voices trembling as they described faces long gone. "That was my world," one said. "I can almost smell the oil again." In schools, teachers used the footage to illustrate how war leaves marks even in silence. newspapers published feature articles connecting Operation Kita to Japan's broader wartime narrative. A story not of conquest, but of endurance and survival. For a country that had spent decades defining itself by its post-war peace, the Ghost Convoy became a symbol of reconciliation, the moment when Japanese precision and American persistence met not in combat, but in shared remembrance. Across the Pacific, American veterans who had once hunted the convoy responded with equal emotion. The U.S. Navy invited members of both research teams to a symposium at Pearl Harbor, commemorating 70 years since the end of the war. There, in the same room where ultra decrypts had once been processed, scholars presented their findings to an audience of aging submariners and young officers. A large screen displayed the ROV footage of Ashigara. As the camera swept over the wreck, silence filled the hall. One retired commander, who had served aboard Blackfin, stood and saluted. "She was our enemy once," he said softly, "but she sailed like a friend." Following the expedition, maritime museums in Tokyo and Honolulu collaborated to create a joint exhibit titled "The Sea Remembers." Artifacts recovered from the wrecks, compasses, insignia, fragments of porcelain, were displayed side by side with Allied navigation tools and sonar logs. The curators deliberately avoided the language of victory or defeat. Instead, the plaques spoke of professionalism, endurance, and the shared humanity of sailors. Visitors moved slowly through the dimly lit rooms, the air filled with the sound of distant waves. For many, it was the first time they realized that the enemy beneath the waves had faces, voices, and fears of their own. The exhibit traveled internationally, drawing large crowds wherever it went. In London, veterans of the Royal Navy who had fought in the Pacific attended its opening. In Manila, it sparked debate about the forgotten history of Southeast Asia's wartime sea routes. But nowhere was the reaction more poignant than in Kourou, where many of the convoy's sailors had lived. Families brought offerings to the waterfront, laying flowers beside memorial stones that bore the names of ships long vanished. One woman, whose grandfather had served as a gunner on Oyodo, placed a photo of him in uniform beside the plaque and whispered, "Now people remember you." For the first time since 1945, the voyage felt complete. The rediscovery of Operation Kita's wrecks did more than satisfy historical curiosity. It bridged a gap between generations. Young Japanese who had grown up hearing only of the atomic bombings and post-war recovery learned that even in defeat, acts of courage and competence had persisted. For Americans, the story offered a reminder that victory had been neither easy nor absolute. Both sides found in the Ghost Convoy a mirror reflecting the complexity of war, its futility, its honor, its capacity to destroy and to dignify at once. In interviews, Professor Mori summed it up simply. "These ships did not die," he said. "They went home, and the sea kept them safe." The final images from the 2015 expedition remain haunting, a camera drifting through the shattered corridors of Ashigara, passing over silent rooms, a single compass frozen pointing north. In the background, the faint hum of the submersible's propellers echoed like a heartbeat. The footage ended not with music or commentary, but with the sound of the ocean itself, a low, endless murmur that seemed to carry voices across time. For those who saw it, the Ghost Convoy was no longer history. It was a living memory, suspended in salt water and silence. The ocean has no memory in the way people understand it, yet it remembers everything. Beneath its surface lie not just wrecks and relics, but the emotions of those who lived and died there, the fear, the determination, the silence between heartbeats. For the sailors of Operation Kita, that silence became eternal. The wrecks of Ashigara, Oyodo, and Kamoi now rest as hollow shells, yet around them life has returned. Coral covers the gun barrels, fish drift through portholes, and seaweed sways where officers once stood. The sea has claimed the ships, but not their story. Every sonar ping that bounces off their hulls, every beam of light that touches their rusted names, reawakens a chapter of history that refuses to fade. For decades, the world forgot their voyage, but the ocean never did. It held the truth in darkness until the world was ready to listen. Modern technology has made the deep ocean accessible in ways the sailors of 1945 could never imagine. Autonomous vehicles glide through trenches with cameras that capture every rivet and shadow. Data scientists reconstruct wrecks in 3 dimensions, turning loss into knowledge. Yet even in the cold clarity of digital models, there is something that escapes measurement. The sound of steel collapsing under pressure, the final breath of air escaping a flooded compartment, the heartbeat of men waiting for torpedoes that never came. These cannot be archived. They exist only in echoes. That is why the Ghost Convoy endures. It is not a record of triumph or tragedy, but of persistence. When the story resurfaced in the 21st century, it resonated far beyond Japan and America. Writers in Europe compared it to the ancient epics of sailors defying the gods, crossing seas that did not want them to survive. Psychologists cited it in lectures about resilience, describing how disciplined routine can sustain people in hopeless situations. Filmmakers used it as metaphor, the idea of a voyage that cannot change fate but continues anyway, because stopping would mean surrendering to despair. The phrase "the Ghost Convoy" began appearing in speeches, documentaries, even business seminars, detached from its historical origin, but still carrying the weight of its meaning, to move forward through the impossible, even when no one is watching. But for those who know the true story, it remains deeply human. It is the tale of men who followed orders, not because they believed in victory, but because they believed in one another. In interviews recorded before their deaths, several survivors spoke not of fear, but of duty and trust. One engineer said, "We knew the Empire was finished, but the man beside me needed the engine to run, and I knew how to make it run. That was enough." Another said, "We did not fight for Japan at that point. We fought for each other." Those words stripped the myth from the war and left only its essence, the endurance of human connection in a world falling apart. In Kuri, where the remains of Oyodo lie buried in the harbor, a small memorial stands at the edge of the pier. It bears no grand statue or inscription, only a bronze plate with a single line: "They came home through fire and silence." Visitors often walk past it without stopping. Yet, on anniversaries of the convoy's arrival, February 21st, flowers appear at its base. Some are left by families, others by strangers. A few are accompanied by folded notes addressed simply, "To those who sailed." When local children ask their grandparents what the monument means, the answers vary. Some say it honors sailors who fought bravely. Others say it honors those who did their duty. The truth is that it honors both and neither. It honors the endurance of ordinary men in extraordinary times. On the other side of the Pacific, at a naval museum in San Diego, an exhibit features the Allied perspective. A glass case displays faded sonar charts marked with pencil circles showing where the submarines thought the convoy might be. The caption reads, "Operation Kita, the one that got away." Visitors often pause there, studying the maps, the missed intersections of fate. In a guest book beside the display, someone once wrote, "They won that day, but the sea took them anyway." Another entry reads, "We hunted them. Now we remember them." In those simple sentences lies the quiet reconciliation that history eventually demands. The passing of time has thinned the ranks of those who remember firsthand. The youngest sailors of the convoy are now gone, their voices preserved only in recordings. Yet their legacy persists in ways they could never have imagined. The Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force teaches the operation as part of its officer training, emphasizing the principles of navigation, coordination, and discipline under pressure. In lectures, instructors remind cadets that those qualities matter most when the outcome is uncertain. "You may not control your fate," one admiral tells them, "but you can control how you face it." The lesson, born in 1945, remains timeless. Scholars often debate why stories like Operation Kita captivate the public so deeply despite their lack of clear victory or heroism. The answer, perhaps, lies in the nature of memory itself. Triumph is loud and brief. Endurance is quiet and lasting. The Ghost Convoy speaks to something primal in the human condition, the refusal to yield even when the world is collapsing. In that sense, the voyage mirrors the larger story of post-war Japan, a nation reduced to ruin, rebuilding through discipline and persistence. The same virtues that carried those ships through the South China Sea later carried the country through reconstruction. History may change context, but character endures. Even now, deep beneath the waves, the convoy's path can be traced with startling precision. Satellite bathymetry reveals faint indentations on the seabed marking where hulls came to rest. Marine life thrives around the wrecks, transforming them into artificial reefs. Divers who visit describe a haunting beauty, the way light filters through shattered bulkheads, illuminating remnants of machinery still bolted to the decks. Some claim to feel an almost sacred presence there, as if the water itself guards the memory of the men who once lived within those walls of steel. Scientists dismiss such notions as imagination, but even they speak softly when describing the site. One researcher confessed, "It feels like entering a cathedral that no one built." The story of the Ghost Convoy has become part of a larger dialogue about how humanity confronts loss. Museums, documentaries, and memorials now use it to explore themes of remembrance, duty, and reconciliation. In an age when wars are often reduced to statistics, Operation Kita offers something personal, a reminder that history is not measured only in battles won, but in moments of perseverance that defy reason. It challenges the audience to reconsider what courage means. Is it charging into victory, or continuing forward when victory is no longer possible? Each generation interprets the story differently. For those who lived through the war, it was a symbol of endurance. For their children, it became a warning about the cost of obedience. For younger generations, it stands as a meditation on resilience, stripped of ideology and framed by awe at the scale of human determination. In classrooms, students watch footage of the wrecks and listen to the voices of survivors, discovering that even the defeated can embody dignity. Teachers ask them to imagine what it felt like to stand on the deck of a ship, surrounded by invisible enemies, guided only by duty and the rhythm of the sea. The silence that follows those lessons is often more eloquent than any discussion. Ultimately, the Ghost Convoy's meaning transcends nationality. It belongs to everyone who has ever faced overwhelming odds and chosen to move forward anyway. Its legacy is not confined to history books or documentaries, but lingers in the collective imagination, where endurance becomes art. Each time the story is retold, it gains new life, adapting to new contexts, yet retaining its core truth, that human beings, fragile as they are, can still act with grace in the face of annihilation. If you visit the coast of Kyushu at dusk, when the sun sinks into the Pacific and the air turns silver, you may notice how the horizon glows faintly. Locals say that on certain nights, when the wind is right, the ocean hums. Fishermen claim it is the sound of old engines. Others say it is the current moving through sunken steel. Whatever it is, it has the cadence of a heartbeat, steady, patient, eternal. It echoes faintly against the cliffs and fades into the dark. It is the sound of history breathing beneath the waves. The ships of Operation Kita will never surface again, but their story has. In that, perhaps, they achieved what they set out to do, to bring something home. And so the Ghost Convoy sails on, invisible but unforgotten, its course fixed not on maps but in memory. It moves through time as it once moved through the sea, slowly, silently, carrying with it the last light of a vanished world.